James Carter, a 38-year-old mechanic from the quiet town of Brookhaven, believed his marriage was the kind of story that would stand the test of time. He wasn't the type to dream big. His happiness lived in the small things: late-night movies, barbecues with friends, and the way his wife, Emily, always hummed when she cooked their favorite lasagna. Emily was the kind of woman who could light up a room without even trying. With her warm smile and an easy laugh, she made everyone around her feel at home. To James, she was his anchor, the person who gave meaning to his steady, unremarkable life. Together, they had built a modest home filled with the trinkets of their shared history: pictures from road trips, James's collection of vintage tools, and the hand-knit blanket Emily had made during their first year of marriage. But lately, James had felt the familiar warmth of their home starting to fade. Emily had always been social, but her outings had become more frequent, her phone always buzzing with messages from new friends James hadn't met. When she started dressing up more than usual for these girls' nights, he couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. Still, he brushed it off. After all, Emily had always been beautiful. Why shouldn't she enjoy looking her best? One evening, James stood in their small kitchen, fixing the leaky faucet Emily had mentioned earlier that week. As he tightened the wrench, he heard the front door open. Emily stepped inside, her laughter carrying into the room like a melody. She was on the phone, her voice light and cheerful. "All right, I'll see you then. Don't forget," she said before hanging up. James smiled as she walked in, her cheeks flushed and her hair slightly windswept. "You're home early," he said, wiping his hands on a towel. "Plans changed," Emily replied, leaning in to kiss his cheek. "How's the faucet coming along?" "Almost there. Just needed a little TLC, like everything around here," he joked. Emily laughed, but it felt distant, like her mind was somewhere else. She grabbed a glass of water and leaned against the counter, scrolling through her phone. James watched her for a moment, a quiet worry taking root in the back of his mind. Over the next few weeks, the changes in Emily became harder to ignore. She started working late, even though James knew her job at the local library rarely required overtime. Her phone, once left casually on the kitchen counter or bedside table, was now always within her reach, its screen lighting up with notifications she quickly dismissed. One Saturday afternoon, as James worked in the garage on an old motorcycle he'd been restoring, Emily came in, her face glowing with excitement. "James, I forgot to tell you. I'm going to a work retreat next weekend. It's just a couple of days, but I'll be back Sunday night," she said, her tone casual but hurried. "A retreat? That's new," James replied, raising an eyebrow. "What's it about?" "Oh, just some professional development thing. Team building, networking. You know how it is," she said, waving it off. James nodded, though the explanation felt thin. He didn't press further. He trusted Emily, or at least he wanted to. The weekend of the retreat came and went, but something didn't sit right with James. He spent Sunday night flipping through channels, trying to distract himself from the nagging feeling in his chest. Emily returned late, her energy subdued but her smile intact. "Miss me?" she teased, setting her suitcase down by the door. "Always," James replied, pulling her into a hug. As the days passed, James tried to convince himself that his doubts were unfounded. But the little things kept piling up. Emily's perfume lingered longer when she came home, and her explanations for her late nights felt rehearsed. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to her story than she was letting on. One evening, as they sat on the couch watching a rerun of their favorite show, Emily's phone buzzed again. She picked it up quickly, her eyes darting to the screen before she placed it face down on the coffee table. "Everything okay?" James asked, trying to keep his voice light. "Yeah, just work stuff," Emily said, her tone dismissive. James nodded, but the seed of doubt had already been planted. The turning point came on a quiet Wednesday evening. Emily was in the shower, and her phone buzzed on the nightstand. James hesitated for a moment, then glanced at the screen. The message preview read, Can't wait to see you this weekend. Miss you already. His heart sank. He knew he shouldn't invade her privacy, but the message left no room for misinterpretation. He unlocked the phone with trembling hands and opened the thread. The texts confirmed his worst fears. Emily had been seeing someone else. James sat on the edge of the bed, the phone still in his hands. The weight of betrayal crushed him, leaving him breathless. How had it come to this? How had the woman he trusted with his heart, his life, become a stranger? When Emily stepped out of the bathroom, she froze at the sight of James holding her phone. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice sharp with panic. "Who is he, Emily?" James's voice was quiet, but it carried the force of his pain. Emily's face crumpled, and for a moment, James thought she might deny it. Instead, she sighed and sat down across from him. "James, I didn't mean for this to happen," she began, her voice trembling. I don't know. I felt stuck, like we were going through the motions, and I needed something more." James stared at her, his mind racing. "More? You needed more? Emily, we built a life together. I thought we were happy." "I thought so too," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. And then I met someone who made me feel alive again." James felt a surge of anger rise in his chest. "Alive? Do you even hear yourself? You threw away everything we had for what? A fling, some thrill." Emily looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "I never wanted to hurt you," she whispered. "Well, congratulations," James said, standing up. "You've done more than that. You've broken us." The rest of the night passed in tense silence. James slept on the couch, his mind replaying their conversation over and over. By morning, Emily was gone, leaving only a note that said she needed time to figure things out. James sat alone in the quiet house, the weight of her absence pressing down on him. The life he had known, the love he had believed in, was gone, replaced by a hollow ache that refused to fade. Emily's absence left James in a state of numbness. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards or the faint hum of the fridge. It wasn't the silence itself that hurt. It was the absence of her presence, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air, the sound of her humming while cooking. It was all gone. For the first few days, James found himself unable to focus. Work at the garage became a monotonous cycle of fixing engines and tuning cars. Even his co-workers noticed his distracted demeanor. "You okay, man?" asked Mike, his longtime friend and colleague, during a break. James nodded, staring into his coffee. "Just going through some stuff at home." Mike didn't press, but the concern in his eyes was evident. James appreciated the unspoken support, but wasn't ready to open up about what had happened. Meanwhile, Emily's absence extended beyond a few days. She texted sporadically, short, vague messages about needing time to think and sort through her emotions. James responded at first, but each reply felt like he was pouring his heart into an empty void. Eventually, he stopped. One evening, a week after Emily left, James decided to take a step he never thought he would. He sat down with his laptop, opened the browser, and typed in, "Private investigator near me." His hands shook as he hit enter. He knew it might seem extreme, but the unanswered questions gnawed at him. Who was this man? How long had it been going on? Was their entire marriage a lie? James didn't want to act out of anger, but he needed closure. The investigator he hired, a gruff man named Carl, promised discretion. "You'll have answers in a week," Carl assured him, sliding a business card across the table. While waiting for Carl's findings, James found himself spiraling. Nights were the hardest. Lying alone in the bed they once shared, he replayed every conversation, every sign he might have missed. The what-ifs were endless, and they left him exhausted. On Friday, Carl called. "We need to talk. Can you meet me tomorrow?" The next morning, James sat across from Carl in a small diner. The investigator slid a manila envelope across the table. "Everything you need to know is in there," Carl said, his voice flat. James hesitated, staring at the envelope as if it might burn him. Finally, he opened it. Inside were photos, receipts, and notes, evidence of Emily's affair. The man's name was Nathan, a wealthy real estate developer from a nearby city. They had been meeting for months, dining at upscale restaurants, staying in luxury hotels. The weight of the truth hit James like a punch to the gut. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the realization that Emily had led a double life right under his nose. He thanked Carl and left, the envelope clutched tightly in his hand. Back home, James spread the contents of the envelope on the kitchen table. The photos stared back at him, each one a stark reminder of what he had lost. But as he sat there, something shifted within him. The heartbreak was still there, but it was joined by a flicker of determination. For years, James had put Emily's happiness above his own. He had built his life around her, shaping his world to fit her needs. Now, it was time to focus on himself. The first step was addressing the legal side of things. James contacted a lawyer to discuss divorce proceedings. It was a painful decision, but he knew it was the right one. He couldn't rebuild his life while holding on to the wreckage of his marriage. Meanwhile, Emily reached out. Her texts became more frequent, filled with apologies and attempts to explain. "James, I never wanted to hurt you," one message read. "Can we meet and talk? Please." James didn't respond immediately. Part of him wanted to confront her, to demand answers. But another part of him, the part that was starting to heal, knew that reopening old wounds wouldn't bring him peace. Instead, he channeled his energy into the garage. The motorcycle he had been restoring for months became his sanctuary. He worked late into the night, his hands moving with purpose as the rhythmic sound of tools drowned out his thoughts. One evening, as he tightened the final bolt on the bike, James stepped back and admired his work. It was more than a restored motorcycle. It was a symbol of his resilience. Around this time, James's friends started pulling him out of his shell. Mike, always the supportive friend, convinced him to join their weekly poker night. "You need to get out of that house, man," Mike said. "Sitting around isn't going to help." The poker nights were a welcome distraction. They reminded James of the importance of friendship and laughter, things that had been missing from his life for far too long. Then came the turning point. While running errands in town, James bumped into Sarah, an old acquaintance from high school. She had recently moved back to Brookhaven after a messy divorce of her own. Their conversation started with polite small talk, but quickly turned into something more meaningful. "Life's funny, isn't it?" Sarah said, smiling softly. "You think you have it all figured out, and then everything falls apart." James nodded, her words striking a chord. "Yeah, but maybe falling apart is how we figure out what we're really made of." They exchanged numbers, promising to catch up soon. For the first time in months, James felt a spark of hope. As weeks turned into months, James continued to rebuild his life. The divorce papers were finalized, and he and Emily parted ways. It wasn't an easy process, but it brought him the closure he needed. He also began spending more time with Sarah. Their shared experiences created an unspoken bond, and their conversations were filled with honesty and understanding. One evening, as they walked along the quiet streets of Brookhaven, Sarah turned to James. "You're stronger than you think, you know," she said. "Not everyone can go through what you did and come out on the other side." James smiled, her words filling him with a quiet confidence. "I guess we're both stronger than we thought." By the end of the year, James's life looked completely different. He had started his own small business, specializing in custom motorcycle restorations. His reputation grew quickly, and he found joy in the work that once felt like an escape. Sarah became a constant presence in his life, not as a replacement for Emily, but as a partner who valued him for who he was. And as for Emily, James heard through the grapevine that her relationship with Nathan had fizzled out. She had moved to another city, leaving behind the life they had built together. James didn't dwell on it. He had learned that his worth wasn't tied to someone else's choices. He had found strength in his pain, using it to rebuild a life that was entirely his own. If you're enjoying this story, make sure to live, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like these remind us of the power of resilience and the importance of moving forward, no matter how hard life hits us. James's life had started to regain a sense of balance. His business was thriving, and his friendship with Sarah had grown into something he couldn't have imagined. She had become more than just a friend. She was his confidant, his partner in healing. But despite the progress he had made, James couldn't escape the lingering shadows of his past. One afternoon, as he sorted through the pile of invoices in his garage office, his phone buzzed. It was an unfamiliar number. Hesitating, he answered. "Hello? James, it's Emily." The sound of her voice sent a ripple of emotions through him. Anger, sadness, and something he couldn't quite place. "What do you want, Emily?" he asked, keeping his tone steady. I need to talk to you. In person." James's first instinct was to decline, but something in her voice, an urgency he hadn't heard before, gave him pause. He agreed to meet her, setting the location at a neutral spot, a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. When he arrived, Emily was already there, sitting in a booth by the window. She looked different, worn, almost fragile. Gone was the confident woman who had left him. Instead, she seemed like a shadow of herself. "James," she said as he slid into the booth. "Thank you for meeting me." "What is it, Emily?" he asked, his tone firm but not unkind. "I thought we said everything that needed to be said." Emily fiddled with the edge of her coffee cup, avoiding his gaze. "I know I don't deserve your time, but I needed to see you, to apologize." James raised an eyebrow, leaning back. "Apologize? For what exactly?" "For everything," she said, her voice trembling. "For lying to you, for betraying your trust, for leaving you the way I did." James studied her, his emotions in turmoil. Part of him wanted to lash out, to make her feel the pain she had caused. But another part of him, the part that had worked so hard to move on, remained calm. "Why now?" he asked. "Why are you telling me this now?" Tears welled in Emily's eyes. "Because I've lost everything, James. Nathan, he left me. The life I thought I wanted, it was all a lie. And now I'm left with nothing but regret." James felt a pang of sympathy, but quickly pushed it aside. He had spent too many nights drowning in his own pain to let her pull him back into hers. "I'm sorry for what you've been through," he said, his voice steady. "But I've moved on, Emily. I can't go back to who I was, to what we had. That part of my life is over." Emily nodded, wiping her tears. "I don't expect you to forgive me, James. I needed you to know that I see now what I lost, and I'm sorry." The conversation ended shortly after, leaving James with a strange sense of closure. He had faced the woman who had shattered his heart, and he had come out stronger. Weeks later, James's life took an unexpected turn. His motorcycle business had landed its biggest client yet, a wealthy collector who wanted a custom build for an upcoming charity auction. The project was demanding, but James poured his heart into it, determined to make it his best work yet. Sarah was there every step of the way, offering encouragement and lending a hand when she could. Their relationship had grown deeper, rooted in mutual respect and a shared understanding of life's hardships. One evening, as they worked together in the garage, Sarah paused, watching James with a thoughtful expression. "You know," she said, You've come a long way since we first reconnected. James looked up, smiling. I couldn't have done it without you. She shook her head. You did this, James. You chose to move forward, to rebuild. I'm just glad I got to be part of it. As the charity auction approached, James finished the bike, a stunning piece of craftsmanship that combined vintage style with modern innovation. The night of the auction was a whirlwind, with bids pouring in from collectors and enthusiasts. When the final gavel fell, the bike sold for a record-breaking amount, cementing James's reputation as one of the best in the business. But the night held one more surprise. As James mingled with the crowd, he came face to face with Nathan, the man who had been at the center of his heartbreak. Nathan's once confident demeanor had faded, replaced by a look of unease. James, Nathan said, extending a hand. I didn't expect to see you here. James regarded him coolly, his hand remaining at his side. I'm here for the auction. What about you? Nathan shifted uncomfortably. I donated some items for the cause. Good for you, James replied, his tone neutral. Nathan hesitated, then said, Look, I know I'm probably the last person you want to talk to, but I just want to say I'm sorry. For everything. James studied him for a moment, then nodded. Thanks. But I've moved on. The exchange ended there, leaving James with a sense of triumph. He had faced the man who had once torn his life apart and realized that he no longer held any power over him. As the months passed, James's life continued to flourish. His business expanded. His relationship with Sarah deepened, and his sense of self-worth grew stronger with each passing day. He had learned that life's greatest challenges often pave the way for its greatest rewards. One evening, as James and Sarah sat on the porch of his newly built home, watching the sunset, Sarah turned to him. Do you ever think about the past? She asked. Sometimes, James admitted, but not in the same way I used to. It's part of who I am, but it doesn't define me anymore. Sarah smiled, taking his hand. You've come so far, James. I'm proud of you. James squeezed her hand, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in years. For the first time in a long time, he felt truly at peace. If you've been enjoying this story, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like these remind us that even in our darkest moments, there's always a way forward. James's life had finally begun to stabilize, but beneath the surface of his newfound peace, tension was brewing. Despite the successes he'd achieved, the growth of his business, his deepening relationship with Sarah, and the closure he thought he'd found, there was a lingering unease. The ghosts of the past, though distant, were not fully laid to rest. It was a crisp autumn morning when James received an unexpected letter in the mail. The envelope was plain, unmarked, but the handwriting on the front was unmistakably Emily's. For a moment, he debated throwing it away, but curiosity got the better of him. Inside was a single-page letter. It wasn't another apology. He'd had enough of those. Instead, it was an invitation. Emily wanted to meet again, this time under the guise of sharing something she claimed would bring closure to them both. She mentioned it was important, but left the details vague. James stared at the letter, torn. Part of him wanted to ignore it, to leave the past buried where it belonged. But another part of him, the part that still sought resolution, knew he wouldn't be able to let it go without hearing her out. When he told Sarah about the letter, her reaction was calm but cautious. What do you think she wants? Sarah asked, her brow furrowed. I don't know, James admitted, but I feel like I need to find out, for myself. Sarah nodded, her hand resting on his. Just be careful. Don't let her pull you back into something you've worked so hard to move past. The meeting was set for a quiet cafe on the edge of town. James arrived early, sitting by a window where he could watch the autumn leaves drift to the ground. When Emily walked in, he barely recognized her. She looked tired, worn down by life in a way that was both shocking and sad. "James," she said softly as she sat across from him. "Thank you for coming." "What's this about, Emily?" he asked, keeping his tone neutral. Emily hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded a piece of paper. "I know I don't have the right to ask anything of you, but I need your help." James leaned back, crossing his arms. "Help with what?" Emily took a deep breath. "Nathan's in trouble. He's facing legal issues, embezzlement, fraud. And now the authorities are looking into me as well. They think I was involved." James's eyes narrowed. "Were you?" "No," Emily said quickly, her voice cracking. "But I was close to him. I lived with him, worked with him. They think I knew what he was doing." James studied her, his emotions a mix of disbelief and anger. "And you're telling me this because you're the only person I have left," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Nathan's abandoned me. My friends have turned their backs on me. I don't know where else to go." James felt a surge of conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to walk away, to leave her to deal with the mess she had chosen for herself. But another part of him, the part that still remembered the woman he had once loved, felt a pang of compassion. "I don't know what you expect me to do, Emily," he said finally. "You made your choices. You chose him. And now you want me to clean up the mess?" Emily shook her head. "I'm not asking you to fix it. I need someone to believe me. Someone to help me prove that I didn't know what he was doing." James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know if I can do that, but I'll think about it." That night, James found himself unable to sleep. Emily's words echoed in his mind, and despite everything, he couldn't shake the feeling that she was telling the truth. He hated himself for even considering helping her, but he also knew that if the roles were reversed, he would want someone to believe him. The next morning, he called Sarah and explained the situation. "You're really considering helping her?" Sarah asked, disbelief in her voice. "I don't know," James admitted. I can't ignore it. Not if there's a chance she's innocent." Sarah was silent for a moment, then said, "I understand. But don't lose yourself in this, James. You've come too far to let her drag you back down." James nodded, appreciating her support even as he wrestled with his decision. Over the next few days, James did his own research into Nathan's legal troubles. The more he uncovered, the clearer it became that Nathan had been running a complex web of schemes, using his charm and connections to manipulate everyone around him. Emily's name appeared in several reports, but always in a peripheral way, never directly implicated. Finally, James decided to confront Nathan. Through a mutual acquaintance, he managed to track him down to a high-end bar in the city. When James walked in, Nathan was sitting at a corner table, sipping a whiskey as if he didn't have a care in the world. "Well, if it isn't James Carter," Nathan said, his trademark smirk firmly in place. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "I want answers," James said, sitting across from him. "About Emily, about what you've dragged her into." Nathan chuckled, leaning back in his chair. Emily. Such a sweet girl. A little naive maybe, but sweet." "Cut the crap," James snapped. "You used her, just like you used everyone else. And now she's paying the price for your mistakes." Nathan's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly recovered. "She knew what she was getting into. Don't let her play the victim with you." James leaned forward, his voice low and firm. "If you think I'm going to let you walk away from this without consequences, you're dead wrong. You're going to come clean about what you did. All of it." Nathan laughed, but there was a nervous edge to it. "And what makes you think I'll do that?" "Because if you don't," James said, standing up, "I'll make sure everyone knows the truth. And trust me, I won't stop until you're held accountable." As James walked out of the bar, he felt a newfound sense of determination. He didn't know how this would end, but he knew one thing for certain. He wouldn't let Nathan or anyone else take advantage of him or Emily again. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. James worked tirelessly to help Emily clear her name, using every connection and resource he had. Along the way, he uncovered more about Nathan's schemes, piecing together the evidence needed to expose him fully. In the process, James found himself reflecting on his own journey. Helping Emily wasn't just about her, it was about proving to himself that he could rise above the pain and betrayal of the past. The climax came in the form of a court hearing, where Nathan was finally forced to face the consequences of his actions. Emily testified, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. When the verdict was announced, guilty on all counts, James felt a wave of relief. Justice had been served, and for the first time in years, he felt truly free. If you've been enjoying this story, make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Stay tuned for the next part of this incredible journey. The courtroom buzzed with tension as Nathan sat at the defendant's table, his once smug demeanor replaced by a mask of barely concealed anxiety. His reputation, his wealth, and his carefully crafted image were unraveling before everyone's eyes. Across the room, James sat quietly, watching the proceedings with a calm resolve. Beside him, Emily clutched a folder of evidence that could finally clear her name. Nathan's trial had become the talk of the town, drawing crowds eager to see the downfall of a man who had built his empire on deceit. For James, however, this wasn't about public spectacle. It was about justice, not just for Emily, but for everyone Nathan had wronged, including himself. The prosecutor presented a damning case, piece by piece, dismantling Nathan's elaborate schemes. Fraud, embezzlement, and manipulation. It was all laid bare. But the pivotal moment came when Emily took the stand. Dressed in a simple black dress, Emily looked both fragile and determined as she stepped forward. The weight of her mistakes hung heavy in the air, but her voice was steady as she recounted her experiences with Nathan. "I trusted him," she said, her eyes scanning the courtroom. "I believed in the life he promised me. But it was all a lie. I had no idea what he was doing behind the scenes, and when I finally found out, it was too late." Nathan's defense attorney tried to rattle her, suggesting she had been complicit in his crimes, but Emily held her ground. With each question, she responded with honesty and clarity, refusing to let guilt or fear overshadow the truth. As James watched her testify, he felt a surprising mix of emotions: sympathy, pride, and a faint glimmer of respect. Emily had made terrible choices, but in this moment, she was taking responsibility and fighting to make things right. The trial stretched on for days, with tension building as the evidence piled up against Nathan. James found himself reliving his own journey through the lens of the trial. His heartbreak, his anger, and ultimately his growth. One evening, after a particularly grueling day in court, James and Emily found themselves alone outside the courthouse. The air was crisp, and the city lights cast long shadows on the pavement. "Thank you," Emily said softly, breaking the silence. "For what?" James asked, his tone neutral. "For believing me, for helping me when I didn't deserve it." James sighed, leaning against a lamppost. "You're right. You didn't deserve it. But I didn't do this for you, Emily. I did it because it was the right thing to do." Emily nodded, her expression somber. "I know, and I'll never be able to repay you for that." James looked at her for a long moment, then said, "You don't need to repay me. Just don't make the same mistakes again." As the trial reached its climax, Nathan finally took the stand. His lawyer had advised him to remain calm and composed, but the cracks in his facade were impossible to ignore. The prosecutor grilled him relentlessly, exposing every lie and contradiction in his testimony. Nathan's arrogance, once his greatest weapon, became his downfall. Under pressure, he lashed out, blaming his employees, his business partners, even Emily. The courtroom watched in stunned silence as his defense unraveled, leaving him exposed as the mastermind behind the entire operation. The jury deliberated for hours, but when they returned, the verdict was clear: guilty on all counts. When the verdict was announced, the courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Nathan's face turned pale as reality set in. His empire had crumbled, and there was no escape. For James, the moment was bittersweet. Justice had been served, but it didn't erase the pain of the past. Still, he felt a sense of closure he hadn't thought possible. As he walked out of the courthouse, Sarah was waiting for him on the steps. She smiled, wrapping her arms around him in a warm embrace. "It's over," she said. James nodded, a weight lifting from his shoulders. "Yeah, it's over." The weeks following the trial were a whirlwind of change. Nathan's assets were seized, his properties sold, and his reputation destroyed. Emily, though cleared of any wrongdoing, decided to leave town. She needed a fresh start, far away from the life she had once shared with Nathan and James. Before she left, Emily met with James one last time. They stood in his garage, surrounded by the tools and projects that had become his sanctuary. "I wanted to say goodbye," Emily said, her voice tinged with sadness. James nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "Where are you going?" "I don't know yet," she admitted. "But I need to figure out who I am without him, without all of this." James studied her for a moment, then said, "Good luck, Emily. I hope you find what you're looking for." She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening with tears. "Take care of yourself, James. You deserve to be happy." With that, she left, closing the door on a chapter of their lives that had been marked by both love and heartbreak. As for James, his journey was far from over. The trial had been a turning point, but it was only one part of his story. He continued to build his business, pouring his heart into every project. Sarah became a constant presence in his life, her warmth and kindness a stark contrast to the turmoil of his past. One evening, as they sat on the porch of his newly renovated home, James looked out at the horizon, a sense of peace settling over him. "You know," he said, turning to Sarah, "for the first time in a long time I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Sarah smiled, taking his hand. "That's because you are. You've earned this, James. Every bit of it." He squeezed her hand, his heart full. The road had been long and difficult, but it had led him to a place of hope and renewal. If you've been following James's journey, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like these remind us of the power of resilience and the importance of choosing to move forward, no matter what life throws our way. James thought he'd reached the peak of his struggles, but life had one final storm left in store. The days following Nathan's conviction felt like a calm after the chaos, a stillness James wasn't sure he trusted. Business was booming. His relationship with Sarah was thriving, and for the first time, he could see a future unclouded by pain. But just when he thought the past was behind him, an unexpected visitor arrived at his workshop, bringing with them a fresh wave of turmoil. It was late afternoon when the door creaked open. James looked up from the vintage motorcycle he was restoring and froze. Standing in the doorway was a young man, mid-20s, with sharp features and an air of desperation. "James Carter?" the man asked, his voice strained. "That's me," James replied cautiously, wiping his hands on a rag. "Can I help you?" The man stepped forward, extending a hand. "I'm Mark Reed, Nathan's son." James's mind raced. He hadn't known Nathan had a child. The revelation only deepened the mystery of why this man had sought him out. "What do you want, Mark?" James asked, his tone guarded. Mark hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I know you have every reason to hate my father. Honestly, I don't blame you. But I need your help." James raised an eyebrow. "Help with what?" Mark pulled a folder from his bag and placed it on the workbench. "After the trial, I started digging into my dad's business dealings. I wanted to know how deep his lies went. That's when I found these. James opened the folder and scanned its contents. Inside were documents, bank statements, contracts, and emails, all pointing to something far worse than the fraud Nathan had been convicted of. It seemed Nathan had been involved in a network of illegal activities that extended far beyond what the court had uncovered. James felt a chill run down his spine. Why bring this to me? Because you've already taken him down once, Mark said. And because I need someone who understands what it's like to be betrayed by him. James sighed, leaning back against the workbench. The thought of diving back into Nathan's web of deceit was exhausting. He had fought so hard to leave it behind. But as he looked at Mark, he saw a familiar pain. The same pain he had felt when his life had been turned upside down. That night, James shared everything with Sarah. She listened quietly, her expression a mix of concern and determination. What are you going to do? She asked, once he had finished. I don't know, James admitted. Part of me wants to walk away. But if what Mark showed me is real, then Nathan's lies are still hurting people. Sarah nodded, placing a hand on his. Whatever you decide, I'm with you. The next morning, James met Mark at a coffee shop. Over steaming mugs of coffee, they laid out a plan. Mark had already reached out to an investigative journalist who was eager to expose Nathan's deeper crimes, but they needed more evidence to make the story airtight. Together, James and Mark began piecing together the puzzle, reaching out to former employees and business partners who had been burned by Nathan's schemes. The process was grueling. Every new lead uncovered more layers of corruption, painting a picture of a man who had stopped at nothing to build his empire. For James, the investigation felt like reopening an old wound, but it also reminded him why he had fought so hard to rebuild his life. As the weeks passed, the tension mounted. Nathan, now serving time in prison, caught wind of their efforts. James began receiving anonymous threats, cryptic messages warning him to back off, but instead of deterring him, they only strengthened his resolve. You're not scared, are you? Sarah asked one night as they reviewed documents at the kitchen table. Scared? James replied with a wry smile. No, angry. Absolutely. The breaking point came when Mark uncovered a key piece of evidence, a hidden ledger detailing Nathan's financial transactions with powerful figures who had helped him cover his tracks. The ledger was the smoking gun they needed, but it also made them targets. One night, as James locked up his workshop, he noticed a black SUV idling across the street. Its headlights flickered, and the engine rumbled ominously. James's heart pounded as he stepped outside, his instincts on high alert. The SUV sped off, but the message was clear. Someone wanted to scare him into silence. The next day, James filed a police report and hired a security consultant to ensure his safety. He also shared everything they had with the journalist, who promised to publish the story as soon as it was verified. Despite the risks, James felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for Mark, for the people Nathan had exploited, and for the truth. The climax came on a stormy evening, fittingly dramatic for the events about to unfold. James, Mark, and the journalist met in a secure location to finalize the story. As thunder rumbled outside, they reviewed the ledger, cross-referencing it with testimonies and documents. The air was thick with anticipation. When the journalist hit publish, a wave of relief washed over James. The story was out in the open, and there was no turning back. Within hours, news outlets picked up the exposé, sparking a media frenzy. Nathan's crimes, once confined to whispers and courtrooms, were now front-page news. For James, it was a victory unlike any other. He had faced down his past and emerged stronger, proving that even in the face of immense betrayal, justice was possible. The fallout was swift. High-profile arrests followed the publication of the story, and Nathan's remaining allies scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. Mark, though burdened by his father's legacy, found a sense of closure knowing he had helped bring the truth to light. As for James, the experience left him with a renewed appreciation for the life he had rebuilt. One evening, as he and Sarah sat on the porch watching the sunset, he reflected on how far he had come. "I never thought I'd be here," he said, his voice tinged with both awe and gratitude. Sarah smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "You've earned it, James, every step of the way." James nodded, a quiet determination in his eyes. "And I'm not done yet. If you've been captivated by this journey, make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like these remind us of the strength it takes to overcome adversity and the power of truth to triumph over lies." The fallout from the expose rippled far and wide. Nathan's name, already tarnished, became synonymous with greed and betrayal. While his network of enablers scrambled to distance themselves, James found himself thrust into the spotlight as one of the key figures who had helped bring the truth to light. It was a surreal feeling, being recognized not for the pain he had endured, but for the strength he had shown in seeking justice. But as much as the world saw him as a hero, James's focus was on protecting the life he had rebuilt. The attention brought new challenges, including intrusive reporters and the occasional stranger showing up at his workshop, hoping to hear his story firsthand. Through it all, Sarah remained his anchor, her steady presence a reminder of how far he had come. One evening, as James closed up the workshop, he received a call from Mark. His voice was tense. "James, we need to talk. Something's come up." "What is it?" James asked, his stomach tightening. "There's someone else involved, someone higher up. I don't have all the details yet, but I'm digging into it. Can we meet tomorrow?" James agreed, though unease settled over him. Just when he thought it was over, another layer of Nathan's deceit was surfacing. He couldn't shake the feeling that this final piece of the puzzle would be the most dangerous yet. The next day, Mark arrived at the workshop, his expression grim. He carried a thick envelope, which he placed on the workbench between them. "This is everything I've found," Mark said. "It points to someone who was pulling the strings behind the scenes, a silent partner in my dad's schemes. If we go after them, it could blow the lid off everything." James flipped through the documents, his jaw tightening as the pieces fell into place. The name that appeared repeatedly was one he recognized, a powerful business magnate with ties to several industries. This wasn't just another con artist like Nathan. This was someone with the resources and influence to crush anyone who got in their way. "Are you sure about this?" James asked, his voice low. Mark nodded. "We've come this far. We can't stop now." The decision to move forward wasn't easy. James knew that taking on someone with this much power would be a gamble. But he also knew that walking away would mean letting them continue their reign unchecked. With Mark's help, he reached out to the journalist who had broken the original story, sharing the new evidence and laying the groundwork for what could be an even bigger expose. As the investigation gained momentum, the threats began again, this time more direct. James received anonymous letters warning him to back off, and one night, Sarah found the windows of their home spray-painted with ominous messages. Despite the fear these tactics instilled, James refused to back down. He had faced too much to let fear dictate his choices now. Sarah, ever the voice of reason, insisted on taking precautions. They installed security cameras and worked closely with law enforcement to ensure their safety. But even with these measures in place, the tension was palpable. The breaking point came during a tense meeting with the journalist. As they reviewed the final draft of the article, a car screeched to a halt outside the office. Moments later, a brick crashed through the window, scattering glass across the room. Attached to it was a note. "This is your last warning." The journalist, shaken but resolute, turned to James. "They're scared. That means we're onto something big." James nodded, his heart pounding. "Then let's finish this." The climax unfolded in a whirlwind of events. The article went live, detailing the shadowy partnership that had enabled Nathan's empire to flourish. Within hours, the story went viral, drawing national attention and prompting an official investigation. The revelations sent shockwaves through the business world, toppling the once untouchable magnate and exposing a web of corruption that had spanned decades. But the victory came at a cost. The backlash was swift, and James found himself targeted by smear campaigns aimed at discrediting him. Despite the pressure, he stood his ground, refusing to let the fear-mongering silence him. Through it all, Sarah remained by his side, her unwavering support a source of strength. One evening, as they sat together on the porch, James turned to her, his voice heavy with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said. Sarah smiled, taking his hand. "You didn't need me to do this, James. You've always had the strength. I just helped you see it." As the dust settled, James found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. The heartbreak, the betrayal, the fight for justice, it had all shaped him into someone he barely recognized. But for the first time in years, he liked the man he saw in the mirror. Mark, too, found closure in the aftermath. With Nathan's legacy exposed for what it truly was, he began rebuilding his own life, free from the shadow of his father's crimes. He and James parted ways on good terms, each grateful for the role the other had played in uncovering the truth. For James, the chapter that had once been defined by pain and loss had finally come to an end. In its place was a new beginning, one marked by resilience, purpose, and the promise of a brighter future. If you've been inspired by James's journey, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us of the power of truth, the strength of the human spirit, and the importance of standing up for what's right. The revelations of the shadowy partner in Nathan's schemes had turned the situation into a boiling pot of tension. James had faced threats before, but the stakes were higher than ever. It wasn't just about exposing the truth anymore. It was about survival. The powerful figure behind Nathan's network wasn't going to go down without a fight. Mark, the investigative journalist, and James had become an unlikely trio of allies. Together, they worked tirelessly, uncovering more evidence that painted a damning picture of corruption and greed. But as they got closer to the final pieces of the puzzle, the threats against them escalated. One night, James's phone buzzed with a message. It was a video, blurry and dark, but the message was clear: a car explosion in a deserted parking lot. The caption read, "Back off, or this will be you." James stared at the screen, his hands shaking. Sarah, sitting across from him, noticed his pallor. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice steady but filled with concern. James showed her the video. She gasped, her face a mix of fear and anger. "We need to go to the police," she said. "We already have," James replied. "They've done what they can. But whoever's behind this has resources. They're not afraid to use them." The tension reached its peak when Mark discovered a new lead: a warehouse on the outskirts of the city where crucial documents were rumored to be stored. The three of them knew it was a long shot, but it was their best chance to uncover the evidence that could bring the shadowy partner to justice. The night they decided to investigate the warehouse was one of those evenings where the air felt heavy with anticipation. James, Mark, and the journalist parked their car a block away, keeping to the shadows as they approached the dilapidated building. The journalist, a wiry man with sharp eyes and an old-school notebook in hand, whispered, "This is either the dumbest or the bravest thing we've ever done." "Probably both," James muttered, his heart pounding. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of shelves and boxes, dimly lit by flickering overhead lights. The air smelled of mildew and dust, adding to the eerie atmosphere. The group split up, each searching for anything that could serve as evidence. James's flashlight beam landed on a stack of file boxes marked with cryptic codes. He began rifling through them, his fingers trembling as he pulled out documents detailing financial transactions, coded communications, and property transfers that linked Nathan's silent partner to illicit activities. It was the smoking gun they needed. Just as he was about to call for Mark and the journalist, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. James froze, his pulse racing, He quickly stuffed the documents into his bag and ducked behind a stack of crates. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by low voices. "They're here," someone said, their tone cold and menacing. James's mind raced. He had to warn the others. Reaching for his phone, he sent a quick text to Mark. "We're not alone. Get out now." What followed was a heart-pounding game of cat and mouse. The warehouse, once a quiet tomb of secrets, became a labyrinth of danger. James moved carefully, keeping to the shadows as the intruders searched for them. His heart sank when he heard the journalist's voice, a sharp cry cut short, followed by the sound of a scuffle. Adrenaline surged through him. He couldn't leave them behind. Clutching the bag of evidence, he made his way toward the sound, his steps silent but determined. He found the journalist first, being dragged by two men toward the warehouse's entrance. Mark was nowhere in sight. James knew he had to act fast. He picked up a loose metal pipe from the ground, gripping it tightly. With a deep breath, he stepped out of the shadows and swung the pipe, catching one of the men off guard. The other turned, but James was quicker, landing a blow that sent him sprawling. "Run!" James shouted at the journalist, who stumbled to his feet and bolted toward the exit. The commotion drew more men into the fray. James darted through the warehouse, using the crates and shelves as cover. He finally found Mark, cornered by two intruders. Without hesitation, James charged, tackling one of the men to the ground. Mark took advantage of the distraction, grabbing a heavy bookend from a nearby shelf and using it to fend off the other attacker. "Let's get out of here," Mark shouted. Together, they made a break for the exit, the sound of shouting and footsteps behind them. When they burst into the open air, the journalist was waiting with the car, engine running. They dove in, and the car sped off, tires screeching against the asphalt. Back at a safe house provided by the journalist's network, the three men sat in tense silence. The bag of evidence lay on the table between them, a stark reminder of what they had risked their lives for. "We have everything we need," the journalist said finally, his voice shaking but resolute. "This will take them down." James nodded, his body still humming with adrenaline. "Let's make sure it's worth it." The next morning, the story went live. It was the culmination of months of investigation, a detailed exposé that named names and laid bare the extent of the corruption. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Law enforcement agencies launched investigations, arrest warrants were issued, and the shadowy partner, once untouchable, became a target. James watched the fallout from his workshop, his phone buzzing with messages from reporters and supporters alike. For the first time, he felt a sense of peace. Not because the fight was over, but because he knew he had done everything he could to stand up for what was right. In the days that followed, James returned to his life with Sarah, grateful for the stability they had built together. Mark decided to move away, seeking a fresh start far from the chaos his father had created. Before he left, he and James shared a quiet moment outside the workshop. "Thank you," Mark said, "for everything." James nodded. "You did the hard part. Don't let his mistakes define you." Mark smiled faintly. "I won't." "Take care, James." As the sun set over Brookhaven, James stood on the porch of his home, Sarah by his side. The horizon glowed with hues of orange and pink, a reminder that even after the darkest storms, there was light. "You've come a long way," Sarah said, her voice soft. "We both have," James replied, wrapping an arm around her, "and I wouldn't change a thing." If you've been inspired by this incredible story of resilience and justice, make sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us that standing up for the truth can change everything, even when the odds are against us. With the revelations about Nathan and his silent partner brought into the open, the dust began to settle. The fallout from the exposé was massive. Businesses distanced themselves from the corrupt magnate, lawsuits flooded in, and public trust in those once powerful figures was irreparably broken. For James, Mark, and Sarah, it was a hard-earned victory, one that came with a bittersweet mix of relief and reflection. James found himself standing on the porch of his workshop, looking out at the quiet street. The threats had ceased, the fear subsided, law enforcement had taken over the investigation, and the dangerous shadow hanging over their lives had finally lifted. Though there was still work to be done, James felt like he could finally breathe again. The journalist who had partnered with them sent a heartfelt thank you note, accompanied by the headline of the published story, The Fall of an Empire: How Justice Prevailed Over Corruption. Beneath it was a personal message. None of this would have been possible without you. James didn't see himself as a hero, but the acknowledgement warmed him. He had never sought recognition, only the truth and the chance to move forward. Mark decided to leave Brookhaven and start fresh in a different city. The weight of his father's legacy was too much to bear in the small town where everyone knew his name. Before he left, he visited James one last time. "You gave me hope," Mark said, his voice thick with emotion, "that I didn't have to be defined by him, that I could choose a different path." James placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. "You've already chosen it. Keep going." As Mark drove away, James felt a mix of sadness and pride. Mark was living proof that even in the shadow of betrayal, it was possible to reclaim your story. For James, life slowly returned to its steady rhythm. His motorcycle restoration business continued to thrive, bolstered by the respect he had earned not just as a craftsman, but as a man of integrity. Orders poured in from across the state, and James poured his heart into every project, finding peace in the work that had always been his sanctuary. His relationship with Sarah deepened in ways he hadn't thought possible. She had stood by him through every storm, her unwavering support, a testament to her character and their connection. One evening, as they sat together under the stars, James reached into his pocket and pulled out a small box. "Sarah," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "you've shown me what it means to be truly loved, to feel supported, seen, and understood. I want to spend the rest of my life with you." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she smiled, her hand covering her mouth in disbelief. "Yes," she whispered. "1,000 times yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger, James felt a weight lift from his heart. After everything he had been through, he was finally building a life filled with hope and love. One afternoon, as James worked in the garage, he found an old photograph tucked into a drawer. It was of him and Emily, taken during happier times. He stared at it for a moment, memories flooding back. There was no bitterness, no anger, only gratitude for the lessons those years had taught him. Emily's betrayal had broken him, but it had also forced him to grow. It had pushed him to find his own strength, to rebuild his life from the ground up. In a way, he realized, he owed her thanks. She had been the catalyst for the person he had become. He placed the photo back in the drawer, a faint smile on his lips. The past was where it belonged, behind him. The story came full circle on a sunny day as James and Sarah hosted a barbecue at their new home. Friends and neighbors filled the backyard, laughter and the scent of grilled food filling the air. It was a far cry from the quiet, lonely nights James had once known. As he watched Sarah laugh with their friends, a wave of contentment washed over him. This was the life he had fought for, the life he had chosen. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, built on honesty, resilience, and love. A young boy from the neighborhood approached James, wide-eyed as he pointed at the gleaming motorcycle parked in the driveway. "Did you build that?" the boy asked. James crouched down to his level, smiling. "I sure did. Maybe one day I'll show you how." The boy's face lit up, and James couldn't help but chuckle. For the first time in years, he felt like the future was something to look forward to, not fear. James's story is a testament to the power of resilience and the importance of standing up for what's right. It's a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there's a way forward. Betrayal may break you, but it doesn't have to define you. What matters most is what you do next. If this story has resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue to share stories of strength, justice, and redemption. And remember, every ending is a new beginning,